All right, well, thank you all so much for joining us today for what will be our fourth presentation from the Clemency Clinic about our trips overseas to Europe to study the European criminal justice and penal systems. We started in Norway and then continued west, I guess, south to the Netherlands and then west over to the UK and ultimately to Ireland this last spring break. And that is a country that has a rate of incarceration of 89 people per 100,000 compared to the United States, which has about 545 people per 100,000. In addition, sentences in Ireland are mostly less than 12 months. So we undertake these trips, I mean, keeping in mind, of course, we're dealing with countries with very different demographics, histories, and social welfare systems, but in the hope that we can nonetheless find some takeaways that can help us in the US make our system less punitive, less focused on mass incarceration, and more focused on rehabilitation. For this trip, I would especially like to thank the following: High Court Justice Siobhan Langford, who very graciously hosted us in her courthouse for a day in Cork, but also introduced us to people at the Irish prisons, the Supreme Court, and the Dáil for the rest of our trip. Supreme Court Justice Iseult O'Malley, who hosted us at the historic Green Street Courthouse, where Robert Emmett was tried for treason, and talked to us about sentencing there. Jane McGowan and Edward Matthews at the Irish Innocence Project. Barry Ward, TD, who arranged our lunch at the Dáil, and Alan Armstrong at the Irish Prison Service, as well as Governor of Limerick Women's Prison, Andrew McCarthy, and Mark Callahan, Governor at Port who facilitated our trips there. So again, thanks to all of those, and with no further ado, I will turn it over to my wonderful students to start talking to you about what we learned, starting, I think, with Zach. Okay.
Hello, everybody. My name is Zach. I'm a 2L here at the school. If you have questions throughout this presentation, just raise your hand and I'll answer them as they come along. So here's our basic agenda for today. I'm going to start by talking about kind of the legal system in Ireland, the difference between solicitors and barristers, and a little bit about the court system there. So first and foremost, here's kind of how the court system works in Ireland. I know there's a lot of information on this slide, but I'll walk through the basics as it relates to criminal courts. So at the bottom right, you see district courts there. That's kind of what we think about, like most misdemeanors are heard. Some appeals then go to the circuit court, but the circuit court is actually a court that hears a lot of cases for the first time. And then what we got to see was a case at the Central Criminal Court, which is right in the center there. And that is a division of the High Court, which the judge that we met there was a lovely member of the High Court, and I believe she hears just cases that arise in the Central Criminal Court, which means cases of murder and rape. In Ireland, there are no distinctions between types of murder, like first or second degree. It's all under one umbrella. There is manslaughter, and we actually got to hear a case, a verdict come down in a murder case when we were sitting in the Central Criminal Court, which was manslaughter by diminished capacity. That was very interesting to see. So the main thing I'm here to talk about today is the difference between a barrister and a solicitor, which if you've never been to Ireland or the UK, you might have no idea that there's such a big division here. We have the barrister's ball, and you might be wondering, where does that word come from and how does that relate to the law? Well, barristers are a very traditional understanding of who gets to practice law. The way I like to think about them is they're a lot more akin to a judge than they are to a practicing attorney, and that they're kind of assigned cases on their own, very like eat what you kill, I think is the phrase that we heard when we were there, which is they're approached with a case from a solicitor, and then they argue that case in court. The person who is client-facing is the solicitor. They don't argue cases in court at all. Only the barristers do. So you can kind of see based on the text on the screen here that the responsibilities of a barrister include the interviewing of witnesses, the preparation of case details, investigation, but most importantly, the case presentation itself. So when we saw a case in the Central Criminal Court, many of the barristers were wearing horsehair wigs, which is a very traditional way of practicing the law. Apparently, those wigs are very expensive, as we heard. The legal system in Ireland, you don't have to go through in a graduate system to become a lawyer. But if you're a barrister, you do have to do extra training, and you have to do what's called deviling, which I think is a very fun word for being an apprentice, essentially, to a barrister. We met with 2 people in Ireland who were deviling to be a barrister. From my understanding, it's very difficult to make it, quotes unquote, as a barrister if you're not good enough or at arguing cases in court, or you don't get enough business from solicitors. Oftentimes, you just won't succeed as a barrister. Solicitors, on the other hand, do a lot of the day-to-day legal work that we associate with attorneys in the US, and they can exist in big law firms rather than just solo practitioners, which is what barristers are for the most part. Solicitors have like established offices, and they do a lot of marketing, client side, and just try to bring in the business. Any questions on that before I move on? Great. So this kind of gives you an understanding, I think, better of who's doing what in the courtroom and the difference between a solicitor and a barrister. Again, there's a lot of text on the screen, but bear with me here. So at the very top, the judge, just like in US courts, sits and presides over the whole thing. You have an interesting dilemma, though, with how the counsel presents themselves. So you have the solicitors facing towards the members of the audience in the same direction as the judge, and then you have the barristers facing towards the judge. So you have 2 rows of attorneys working in the same case that are essentially facing each other, and they pass notes during the trial. On the other side, you have the accused sitting on one side. I know in certain places like the UK, they actually have like a central location where the accused would sit and stand witness to their trial. The courtroom that we saw with the Supreme Court justice had that system. I don't really like it very much. To me, it looked like the accused kind of was a witness to their own trial in a way that they're not sitting with the attorney at the bench, with their own attorney at the table. And so the barristers are kind of arguing for them, but they're not hearing from them or talking to them at all. That was an interesting dilemma. And then we actually, when we were sitting, we just kind of sat almost in the front row there and watched a murder trial as it took place. Any questions on how the courtroom works? Any questions at the end? Okay, great. Well, with that, I will move on to the next. And great, thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Kylie.
And I'm Ellen.
And we'll be talking about how the Irish court system works, kind of through the lens of the trial that we observed that Jane Ann and Zach talked about with Justice Langford. So starting, we'll kind of go chronologically through the court proceeding. So starting with jury selection. I don't know how many of you have sat through either as a potential juror or as a witness a U.S. jury selection, but they are long. They are all day, sometimes like longer than all day proceedings. There's an entire industry centered around jury selection, like jury selection advisors. It is not like that in Ireland at all. It's shorter. I think it lasted maybe an hour and a half whenever we went. And part of that is because it is way more impersonal, and the lawyers, both solicitors and barristers, have almost no information about the jurors. They receive their name and their occupation, and that is it. And then each side, both the defense and the prosecution, have 7 chances to object for no reason. They don't like the look of someone or whatever their occupation is. They can just object. And then they have unlimited chances to object for cause. So if, like, at the start, the judge will read a list of the people involved in the proceeding, whether they were the police or witnesses or anything like that. And if they know someone or have a potential entanglement, they, of course, probably should not be on the jury. And then with those 7 chances to object that either side gets, if the other side thinks that they're objecting for discriminatory reasons, they can raise an objection to that, and then the judge will handle that as it comes. But we thought it was really interesting that whenever, like, solicitors are the ones that do the objections, even though barristers are the ones arguing the case, wearing the fancy wigs, all of that. Because we saw quite a few objections from both sides. And it was the solicitors that were the ones that objected and really had no clue, but it seemed pretty mechanical and way less tailoring of the jury, which we talked about on the trip and thought that there were pros and cons to both how we do it and how Ireland does it, where as here, both sides get to kind of craft a jury that thinks they would fit, like see their narrative or side with it, which could be good or bad. And then in Ireland, it's kind of almost more of a general objective polling of the populace, which again, depending on your point of view, could be good or bad, depending on how the case comes out.
Yeah, and I'll add one thing about jury selection. After we spoke with two barristers about the jury selection process, and they didn't even need to know like the occupation. They weren't bothered or concerned that they didn't know anything about the members of the jury, which was just striking because here, the attorneys try to get as much information as possible about potential jurors. So we then witnessed an opening statement in a murder case, and the most striking thing here was that the prosecution only gives an opening statement. The defense does not have an opportunity to do so. They only have an opportunity to give a closing. Now, the opening statement itself is a little different. It's not very argumentative. It's completely not partisan. It's completely objective, presenting the kind of the facts as they are, who the witnesses will be, where it took place, but not partisan. Very casual, the one we saw, was the barrister was very casual and relaxed, leaning against the podium. And so, yeah, that was kind of how the opening statements worked. And the prosecution is the only one that gets that initial opportunity.
I think we were pretty shocked whenever we were told that we would only be seeing one opening statement. So I think in a lot of American court trials, the opening statement and the closing are kind of like the punchy, the fun parts that you kind of want to see whenever you go to observe a trial. It's quite boring. So after hearing the opening statement, I think we were a lot less up or indignant about the fact that only the prosecution got to give the opening statement, because it was really just, this piece of evidence shows this, flipped the binder. This is a map that shows the apartment building where whatever.
Yeah, very dry.
Yeah, it was not, because I was really excited to see an opening statement, and it was way less fun than I thought it was going to be, because they don't really give a theory of their case at all. And then, okay, so now we'll talk about a practice called marshalling the evidence, which comes into context, like Zach alluded to. We saw a verdict come down in a case about murder versus manslaughter by diminished capacity. And so we got to see kind of the lifespan of the trial. We got to see jury selection, opening statements, some evidence discussion, and then in a separate trial, a verdict come down. And marshalling the evidence refers to a practice in which the judge kind of contextualizes factual information and explains a concept to the jury. And in our case, the jury they were deliberating about the verdict and then had posed a question to the court about what some version of the statute that defines diminished capacity means. And Justice Langford explained what that meant and kind of gave examples in how Irish courts have thought about and interpreted this statute. And we thought that was really interesting compared to courts in the US, because we have so many rules of evidence with expert witnesses and with judges and with lawyers about not infringing on the role of the jury and letting them be the finders of fact and just kind of explaining the law to them. And we didn't Justice Langsford's explanation was solely focused on the law, but it was way more guidance than juries in the US would get on this subject, I would think.
Yeah, and we've read, there are critiques and papers of this who call out marshalling of the evidence in more extreme cases than what we saw, where there's fear that the judge is really speaking directly to the jury and telling them, injecting their personal beliefs, or that's what it can be critiqued for, which we just thought is really interesting, because that's something that the U.S. system very, very much does not tolerate.
Yeah. And I think after talking to the barristers and solicitors and Justice Langford and her clerk, Julie, and seeing the differences. I think a lot of the things that we were shocked about, they were also shocked that we were shocked. They were like, well, of course this is how it is. We don't know anything about the jury. Well, of course the judge will explain the law. How else will the jury know? Like, of course only the prosecution lays out the facts. So I think that also kind of reinforced the idea that like nothing is a given for how any court system does it. There's no like automatic or immediate correct answer, and a lot of our thoughts on the matter were kind of colored by like growing up with the American court system and seeing it, before law school and like TV and movies, and then now getting to witness it from kind of the inside. So I thought that was interesting too.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to transition to talking about sentencing, and then some of the other students will talk about kind of what we saw when we toured prisons and things like that. So first was sentencing. We had the opportunity to meet with Supreme Court Justice, although I think they call them judges, the Supreme Court Justice judges, with Judge O'Malley, who is on the Judicial Council's Sentencing Guidelines Committee, as well as Tom O'Malley, who I believe also sits on that committee. So currently, Ireland does not have sentencing guidelines, and it's very much up to the discretion of the judges. But there is, in progress, there's a committee that's working to draft sentencing guidelines. So we spoke with Judge O'Malley about this. And, coming from the United States, we really cautioned against sentencing guidelines, raising concerns about how when you implement these guidelines, sentences often just increase dramatically, and we've seen that here. And even when we spoke with students at the Innocence Project in Ireland, one of the things they said was, we do not want sentencing guidelines. But they were telling us that they're trying to be really intentional with creating these sentencing guidelines, and they specifically emphasized their efforts to collect data on, the current charges and what are the average sentences for various crimes, and that it's important for them this time. They want to get it right on the first time. They don't want to have to go back and amend things later, because that's really hard to do. And they talked about, how in England, one thing that they've seen that they want to avoid is when England implemented sentencing guidelines, they all of a sudden started to incarcerate people for crimes for which they previously weren't sending people to prison. They kind of grouped these people into a category without doing the data and realizing in reality those people weren't getting incarcerated. So that's something they want to avoid. So they're still in the data collection process to try to figure that out, which was really interesting. They do seem like they're trying to be really intentional, but we did also raise our concerns with what we've seen sentencing guidelines do in the United States.
One thing that they talked a lot about is their debate on whether or not to use the chart that we have here that measures our criminal history category with the offense level. They seemed opposed to the idea of using someone's past crimes as a means to increase their sentence, and that kind of mechanical box by box way, which we thought was really interesting. And then one thing that we also thought was kind of crazy in the Irish sentencing scheme in general is that there's no plea bargaining in criminal cases. So the way that their sentencing scheme works is you can plea and you can get a third reduction or something, but in murder cases, there's no plea bargaining. And so there's not really any reason if you've been accused of murder or arrested for murder not to go to trial. And so a lot of times, Justice Langford was saying it's we all kind of know, the evidence is incontrovertible that this person committed this crime, but the prosecution still goes through every burden of proof that they have to hit because there's just no benefit to pleading, which I thought was really interesting. And also there are no life sentences there. Here, life sentence doesn't always mean life, but a lot of times it does. Whereas in Ireland, I think it's automatically at 25 or 30 years, there's no life sentences, which we thought was interesting. And we'll look to see how this changes with the new sentencing guidelines being developed. But talking to Justice O'Malley and Tom O'Malley was really enlightening to see how, the thought going into their system and all of what they're looking at to help create it. And now we'll pass it on to Kate.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate, and I'm going to talk a little bit about our visit to Limerick Women's Prison. So we just heard about sentencing. Now we are sort of the next stage in the criminal justice process. And sort of like Jane Ann was talking about at the beginning, I think the impetus behind a lot of these trips is to go visit a country that approaches punishment from sort of a different standpoint. We have a particularly punitive system in the U.S., and some of the other European countries that the clinic has visited take generally, I'd say, a more rehabilitative approach to punishment. And in pursuit of sort of visiting, engaging in this sort of exchange of approaches, we visited the brand new, recently opened in, I think, in 2023. I put in quotes healing prison because that's what a lot of the media, or what I believe the actual prison and then, some of the media coverage, discussed the new women's wing, I guess, of the larger Limerick prison, being described as this place that was, a place to house women who had been convicted of crimes, but generally was more focused on sort of the rehabilitative efforts and programming to help these women, serve their sentences in a way that's going to be productive for them after the fact. So I think one of the, or if not the most interesting thing about the new wing was the sort of trauma-informed design aspects of it. There's actually a very interesting article from an architectural publication that was talking about how the plans were based on like waiting rooms in cancer centers, which I thought was interesting. You can see these are some photos that we took, so they're not the highest quality, but you can kind of see with, actually, you can. Well, actually, you can see the garden. There's like a, sort of the central courtyard, what would normally be like the exercise yard, is kind of a nice garden that's central to where all of the cells are. In some ways, I would say it kind of feels like a yard on a college campus. And, it's light, it's open, certainly more than any other prison facility that I've ever been to. I think particularly the trauma-informed design aspects come out in the sort of technology that they utilized. For example, I think sort of like traditional prison, you would have like a big metal door and like a flap that you would open up so that you could like talk to the prisoners. And then the governor that we met with and toured mentioned like, that sound of like, opening it up, like a guard opening it up, barking something at, a prisoner who's inside and then slamming it down. If you're a person that, has a history of violent victimization or, otherwise is like aroused by loud and startling sounds like that, that could sort of further add to your traumatization. So instead they have this new, it's called smart glass, but essentially they press a button and like there's a glass window on the cell door and it like unfogs and you can look in and say something. So that's just like one example. They also mention like, instead of having like big, heavy keys and like doors that slam, they have a digital unlock, which is, I guess, just both easier for guards to utilize, facilitates an easier process of getting folks from cells to, exercise or sort of general time outside in the community spaces, and also is less sort of re-traumatizing with the, sort of, there's fewer aesthetics, I would say, of re-traumatization and sort of like, punitiveness broadly. And also I featured here, they had some artwork. I believe it's from I read an article, it's from the like Limerick Arts College, donated a lot of student artwork to line the walls, which is certainly not something that you often see in prison facilities. And we, laughed because this is like an example. These are like plates that have been painted on that are on the wall, and we were like, wow, that's just like, I am thinking like in the US, you would immediately hear people be like, well, that's a weapon, like we need to, keep it away. And so there's just, I think, a different approach to creating this space in order to sort of foster an environment where people are able to, be rehabilitated to a certain extent. And I would also just add, like a lot of, prisons in the US, there's a focus on, job training programming, art classes, other kinds of, addiction programming, like mental health care. There's a focus on connecting people with the tools that they'll need to succeed outside. And I mentioned this, but this is just a women's unit. So it's a 50-bed wing of the larger Limerick prison, and I'll talk about it a little bit on the next slide, but we, spent most of our day in the women's side. We were able to speak to some women who were incarcerated there. They were having a showcase for their artwork, because they had a lot of art classes that were just ending, and so we got to go and sort of hang out, talk to women who were there, talk to the instructors who were there, and it's a very open environment. We were there at a time when it was the chunks of the day where they got to be outside their cells with just sort of the doors open. And then, so we were there, and then at the very end, we walked through the men's wing as we were on our way out, and it's just night and day, the difference. The men's wing is very much traditional structure, big heavy metal doors. It's dark, was I think originally constructed in the 1800s, and it has been updated since then, but still is kind of the center nucleus and spoke system. And so it's just, I think, very interesting. This innovation I think is really unique and great. For now, it seems to only be focused on the women, which I think is something that we can talk about too. It's an interesting approach. And I said all these really wonderful things, I think, about the sort of trauma-informed approach. They still are struggling with some of the same issues that we face here in our prison system. Overcrowding was sort of immediately an issue. It's a 50-bed facility. When we were there were 93 women who were there. So, they had some rooms, which you can kind of see here. They had a bed or a couch and a TV. And then in the very bottom corner, this is a corner of a cot, because the room was only supposed to have one person, but they had to shove extra beds in there. So facilities are nicer, but still, you see it's just sort of overflowing with people, people being cots, multiple cots to a room, essentially, where originally it should not be that full. Additionally, another issue that we face in the States, understaffing of the prisons is a big issue, and I think someone else will talk a little bit about the prison officer training and sort of the efforts that the country has been making to recruit more prison officers. But they have all of this really wonderful infrastructure in the women's wing for visits from family members and community spaces that people can go and sit. But they can't do that if they don't have guards that can, prison officers that can be present and oversee. So I think a lot of the space is kind of wasted in a sense if you don't have the staff to be able to actually execute those good programs. And particularly, they mentioned that one of the proposed remedies is having folks do court appearances virtually, because if everyone has to go into court, or if someone's petitioning for resentencing or something, has some other reason to be in court, which apparently is quite often, then that sort of takes all of the guard capacity to, and then folks have to stay in their cells for much longer just because they don't have the staff to oversee the sort of more open model. And then I would finally just end, one of the things that we discussed with the governor, and I think sort of Kylie and Ellen pointed to, they have a different approach to sentencing, which generally I would say results in shorter sentences than you would receive for, a similar crime in the States. And again, there are certainly, arguments that could be made for the merits or the cons of that. And, generally, again, merits and cons of having more rehabilitative programming. But with shorter sentences, one of the issues that the governor was pointing to was saying we see a lot of repeat people who come in for 3 months at a time because 3 months just isn't long enough for our programs to make a meaningful difference in their addiction issues or job training or other things. So, on the one hand, I think generally a less punitive approach has quite a bit of merits, but also it's, I think, in some ways impacted the effectiveness of the rehabilitative programming that they have. All right, and I will pass it on to someone else. All right.
Hi, everyone. I'm Anne Marie. I'm a 3L, and I'm one of the student directors of the Clemency Clinic. So I'm just going to talk about more broadly what incarceration looks like in Ireland, and then talking about the staffing that Kate mentioned. So there has been a significant increase in the incarceration rate in Ireland in recent years. Even though Professor Murray mentioned that it's only 80-something per 100,000, much lower than here, it still exceeds what the prisons are technically supposed to handle, up to 124% in December in 2025. There are a couple different converging causes for that, including an overall national population increase. Ireland's population has increased significantly in recent years at a rate not seen in a long time. And this prevalence of short prison sentences for minor offenses, like Kate mentioned. So on one hand, while shorter sentences allow people to get out earlier and they're on the other hand have less to do in prison, less rehabilitation, it also might empower judges to impose these shorter sentences because they don't see them as punitive. So more people are being sentenced and sent into the prisons, and even though there's a constant churn and a constant turnaround in many of these lower security places, we're still operating on average at this 124% level. As a result, across all prisons, there is far fewer opportunities for programming and services, far fewer classes, educational opportunities, job training, family visits, gym, etc., because these staff resources are so stretched, managing the influx of people and trying to distribute the services that they have among those groups. In addition, Ireland had perhaps previously prided itself, especially in the newer prisons, on having more humane living conditions, rooms for just one person instead of 2 or 3. But now, because of the increase in the prison population, those spaces are being crowded as well, so making them less effective at what they were intended to do in providing independent living opportunities for people to then return to the community more effectively. One interesting aspect of the Irish prison reform movement and oversight of the prisons is the involvement of European governance. So the European Committee for the Prevention of Torture has recently inspected the prisons a couple times and come out with some pretty harsh rulings about some of their practices, like, for instance, shining flashlights into cells to see whether people were in their rooms if they were sleeping. One of the officers at the Portlaoise Prison Officer Training Center was telling us that had recently been found to be a form of torture because it prevented people from sleeping through the night. So that kind of inspection oversight from the European Union as well add additional pressures for prison officials to maintain a higher level, perhaps, of welfare than we see in the United States, where the prison system is far less centralized. You have local jails, state prisons, federal prisons, without a lot of central oversight. Turning to what some others have alluded to, including Kate, about prison staffing in Ireland. That's something we heard from several people involved in the criminal system, that the staff isn't prepared to handle the increase in population. It just really stretches their resources. What prison officials told us is that they don't really see that as a need to hire more staff. They'd rather reduce the prison population. But still, overcrowding limits the staff's ability to provide the intended programs and services. One thing they emphasized to us was that there are relatively few incidents of officer-prisoner violence. And this is, a relatively stable and high-paying civil service job where you can get a lot of overtime. So that does make it a fairly attractive position for a lot of people, especially people without college degrees. I've listed here the occupation and starting salary for some comparable positions. Prison officers are paid similarly to police officers, a little bit less than teachers, but they do have that overtime option. So it levels it out and makes it something that people can aspire towards having a long career in without as much of the burnout and overwork, without enough pay that we see here in the United States. So we visited the Irish Prison Service College in Portlaoise, which is where all prison officer recruits from across the country come to start their training. Prison officer training is about It's 2 years overall. You spend 4 semesters in the program. The first is spent in Port-Leash, where you do residential training, and then semesters 2 through 4 are online classes done while you're actually working in the prison. The first semester is the typical physical training, de-escalation, conflict management. We saw some practice cells and some fake knives in there. I was locked in. It was a harrowing experience for about 30 seconds. And then what was interesting, though, was the emphasis on ethics and human rights and psychology for those next 3 semesters. And because you have this nationalized prison service, they can really deliver a more effective form of education and training for those officers. They do get a higher certificate at the end in custodial care. It's kind of similar to an associate's degree. And all of this is centered around these goals of rehabilitation. So the staff that we met there emphasized the importance of training officers to treat people in their care well and to help them prepare to return to the community. All right, turning now to that return to the community, we're going to have some people talk about rehabilitation.
Hello, I'm back just to briefly talk about our visit to a nonprofit called the Soul Project. Essentially, this project is sort of a community center that provides a lot of services for women who are struggling with addiction or living in poverty, and I believe almost all of them had had contact with the justice system. But I should also just say, just sort of broadly, we attended the prisons, we talked to judges, we're sort of touching, the purpose of our trip was to touch many different areas of the justice system and how it, really works for people that, are a lot like our clients in many ways that we work with in the Clemency Clinic. This nonprofit that we visited worked exclusively with women, who struggled with addiction, who had, lived in poverty, many of whom, particularly some that we met when we were there had children. It was an interesting opportunity to see, again, how, just outside of the court system, the other sort of infrastructure that Ireland has and provides for people that are struggling with a lot of the same issues that, the folks that are, impacted by the justice system here are. So as I mentioned, Soul Project, we had the opportunity to go on, I think it was the Saturday of the St. Patrick's Day parade, and so they were all of the women there who were part of, who were essentially clients, of the center, were getting together and had like a traditional Irish breakfast and then went off to the parade. So you can see down here, we had the opportunity to sit and talk with them and get to hang out a little bit. So that was very nice. But essentially, I would say the project provides a lot of different services. I would say it's pretty similar to some, other, I would say like, women's shelters or, nonprofits that help folks dealing with addiction here in the States. They had addiction recovery services, I believe like therapeutic services. They focused a lot on art, which I thought was really interesting. And I should also mention they're supported and funded by the government. So it's, essentially a government-sponsored project, which is good and bad for various reasons. I think in the States, there are often limits on what you can say and what you can do with government money. But, sort of interesting to see the federal or the government of Ireland, supporting a project that's like a little bit more, I would say, or focuses a little bit more on alternative methods of recovery, kind of. And the one thing that I would really point out, which I thought was different than at least any sort of like addiction or like women's support center that I'd encountered in the States, is that they don't require 100% sobriety of the people who go through the program. You don't have to be 100% sober to access their services. And we were talking with the director, and he was saying, so many women are, turned away and are discouraged from, seeking help because of that sort of stringent requirement. And he, noted that that's often a barrier to getting help for the women going through the program. So I thought that was an interesting facet. And yeah, you know, education, and actually the one other thing before I pass it on that I'll mention is they also had a staff of healthcare advocates that would go with the women to like their doctor's appointments. You know, women struggling with addiction, living in poverty are not always in, you know, the best position to advocate for themselves and their health needs in sort of like a formal doctor's office environment, particularly if you are, you know, still using. Having addiction issues can really be a barrier for, you know, getting taken seriously and having your healthcare needs met. So they provide a service where caseworkers will go with the women to the doctor's office and advocate for them on their behalf. So a really unique project with, I'd say, some sort of like creative in ways to, you know, sort of providing holistic care for women that are struggling with addiction. I will pass it on to Saeed for our final part.
Hello, everyone. My name is Saeed Youssef. I am a 2L. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about our visit to Pavi Point, which is a NGO focused on improving the lives of the traveler and Roma communities in Ireland. So I'm going to focus mostly on the traveler side of it because that's what we heard a lot of. So the Irish Travelers are an indigenous group to Ireland. There's approximately 40,000 of them in Ireland, and they follow a traditional nomadic way of life, meaning they move from place to place. And typically their jobs that they engage in are manual labor and trades, and they have a strong emphasis on horse ownership, because that is a important symbol of the traveler identity and tradition. And so sadly, throughout Irish history, the traveler and Roma communities have faced negative portrayals that have led to their social exclusion and widespread discrimination that they face. And the systematic discrimination that they did face and continue to face has led to higher rates of poverty, unemployment, homelessness, poor health conditions, and also limited access to education and limited educational achievement. And this kind of started in 1963. There was a commission that published a report on the situation with the traveler community in Ireland, and they, I'm going to quote them, but they portrayed them as the problem arising from the presence of the traveler community in Ireland. So you could already see that negative portrayal itself could lead to future policies and laws, which ended up happening. So the report kind of recommended that the traveler community kind of have a forced settlement to leave their nomadic way of life and also to just assimilate into the mainstream Irish society. And so from that policy document and report, there was influx of laws and policies that negatively affected the traveler community, some of them being criminalizing just their way of life. So there were restrictions on market trading. There were also restrictions on horse ownership. And specifically an example is the Housing Act of 2002, which criminalized trespassing on public and private lands. And for a nomadic community, that is just how that they live their life, they would be inherently trespassing on land. So when they criminalized it, they targeted effectively just the communities of the traveler and Roma communities. And so in 1985, Pavi Point was established, and their main mission, as you can see on the screen, is to improve the quality of life of both traveler and Roma communities, promote their equality and human rights, increase their participation and inclusion in Irish society, and lastly, work towards social justice for these communities. And so since being established in 1985, there's been like three big outcomes. One is that on March 1st, 2017, in part due to Pavi Point's advocacy of the traveler community, Ireland formally recognized the traveler community as a distinct ethnic group. And this had a profound impact on the traveler community because it formalized their identity and recognition at the highest level of government. And then in 2020, the NGO received the Max van der Stoel Award, which is given to organizations, entities, institutions that focus on improving the lives of minority groups. And so due to their work on behalf of the traveler community and Roma community, Pavie Point got that award. And then lastly, in 2022, the Pavie Point, other traveler communities and organizations, and the University of Limerick got into a partnership in where they focused on highlighting the systematic issues within the criminal legal process that travelers faced. And so first, one of the big things that they determined from that study was that there's an overrepresentation of traveler communities in prisons. So the traveler community in Ireland make up of like 1% of the Ireland population, but in prison they account for 10% of the population. And in their interviews, they also found that a lot of travelers indicated that there have been a lot of instances where the police have just entered their homes and engaged in uninvited searches. 50% of the respondents of the study said that they have had a time where they reported police just entering their home. And then in regards to trust in the legal system, 82% of the travelers in this study believed that judges were more strict and more punitive against them because of their status as a traveler as compared to non-travelers. And then lastly, which I kind of found the most problematic, was the fact that the bail determination, the travelers' nomadic way of life is kind of treated as a flight risk. And so based on legal precedent from a case titled Rice v. Monaghan, it allows the exclusion of travelers from entire towns or county, as a bail condition. And so the travelers who did receive bail, they indicated that almost all of their bail determinations were given with conditions, and they voiced that they were also given the condition of being excluded from that specific town or county that they committed the crime, which often separates that individual from the traveler community. And for them, the family is a very, very important piece of the community, and they hold familial values very strongly. And so that would conflict with that, and it would also conflict just generally with their nomadic traditions and culture. And so Pavie Point is continuing to fight for the recognition, respect, and the full access of human rights for travelers and Roma communities. And we were very grateful to hear just a little bit about their work and as they continue their fight for justice. And on that note, that's the end of our presentation. Thank you.
I want to thank Gary Broderick and Paula Carney at the SAIL project and Martin Collins at Pavie Point.